Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to Ethical Perspectives in the News. My name is Pete Welch, and I'll be your moderator this morning. This morning, we'd like to talk about a topic that's been in the news recently, and that topic is the use of drones. And in this particular program, we're going to talk about the non-military use of drones. With us first this morning is Brian Gardner, who's the Linn County Sheriff. Good morning, Brian.
Good morning, Peter.
And also with us is Jeffrey Cox, who's with the University of Iowa and was formerly president of the Hawkeye chapter of the ACLU. Good morning, Jeffrey.
How are you?
Good. And finally, we have with us Mr. Paul Ronan, who's a retired strategic planner at Rockwell Collins. Paul, good morning. First of all, thank you all for joining us this morning. In recent comments made in Congress, our Senator Grassley, acknowledged that there's a whole range of uses for drones and farming. Some of those could be for a farmer checking for early signs of pests and diseases. Another would be to prevent thefts of crops or livestock. But many others are concerned about privacy matters and whether it's the government running these drones or just a farmer out there surveying his own fields. This is true, especially in light of recent events in the public. What do we think about the use of drones? ACLU has taken certainly some positions on this, hasn't it?
Well, you know, I think drones themselves are just toy airplanes. I mean, it's like saying taking a position on cameras. You know, certainly civil libertarians don't have a position on cameras generally, but I do think we have to have some worries about what uses drones are going to be put to. And in the context of a growing commitment by every level of government, I would say from the White House right down to the courthouse, to extending the surveillance that's directed against the American people. And some of this public, some of it private, some of it secret. And so the worry about drones is really part of a much broader worry. The extensive use of criminal background checks, the use of automatic cameras to give people criminal records, the NSA spying that's been revealed lately. So I think that the question is not drones per se, it's the question of what specific uses are going to be made of them. You know, when some people, I think, still remember the Occupy movement. You remember the Occupy movement? Okay. I live across the street from the park in Iowa City where the Occupy people showed up when I looked out my window one morning, and there were tents all over the place. And before the day was over, Officer Kevin Bailey of the Iowa City Police Department came around to our house, and he asked if he could put up a 24-hour surveillance camera on our house to view the occupants of the park 24 hours a day. I think he probably picked the wrong house, but at any rate, he told us that this is for their protection. It's for their own good. And my wife asked Officer Bailey, well, if it's for their own good, maybe if you got their permission to have a camera on our house every day, 24 hours a day, maybe we would agree to do it. But he wouldn't go over and ask their permission. In fact, he got very angry with us, told us we weren't cooperating with the police, and so forth and so on, which raised the question of really why did he want a 24-hour surveillance camera on here? And I think the fact that our political leaders at all different levels are kind of shrugging off the worries that people have about universal surveillance is really the worry here. I mean, President Obama, in responding to the recent leaks on NSA spying, declared last Friday in San Jose, California, he said, "I am not Big Brother." Yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, you certainly haven't missed the opportunity here to crucify Officer Bailey from Iowa City.
Well,
but are you saying that if
I'm not crucifying him, I'm just telling you what happened.
If somebody were to suspect that there may be criminal activity afoot that setting a camera there is a prohibited thing, and you wouldn't want that?
I don't think it is. I think there are some uses for cameras and you know, cameras in public and so forth. What our worry here is a trend. It's a trend of increasing surveillance and increasing sort of criminalization of people based on increasing surveillance. And the worry here is that the people who are in charge of this are not sufficiently worried themselves about it. I mean, when President Obama said, "I am not Big Brother," I was reminded of Richard Nixon's famous statement, "I am not a crook." Okay. Richard Nixon was a crook. And I think President Obama is Big Brother. Okay. I think
We clearly know where you are on this issue, yeah. Jeffrey. Yep. So, Brian, I'm going to drag you in, right, kicking and screaming. And isn't there a public safety and interest in if you can anticipate conduct or something like this to keep people driving or whatever? Isn't there a use for drones in some type of maintaining the social norms?
Sure. I think that there can be a use for drones in a law enforcement realm. What I'm thinking of specifically is, let's say, a missing child or a missing person or something that you're looking for, and perhaps it's in a wooded area or a field or something like that. And I think that a drone would fit perfectly in that. It would allow us to have, obviously, an aerial perspective and be able to see things that a person walking would not be able to see readily. You could probably extend that to if you're chasing someone for criminal activity and they run out into a field or they run out into a culvert or someplace like that. Not a culvert, but a ditch or something like that, and they disappear. Perhaps a drone with a camera mounted on it would be helpful there. I think where we get into a gray area, perhaps even the other side, would be, do you just use this on a daily basis? Do you actually use it for surveillance activities? And I think that most law enforcement agencies and administrators are kind of taking a wait-and-see attitude on that to see what the court has to say on that. I know I can walk up to your house by the most direct path up your walkway and knock on the door uninvited and speak with you. But the court gets a little concerned when I start snooping through your windows on the outside of your house. And whether or not you'll be able to use a drone and fly it over your backyard and surveil things without your permission, without your knowledge, it probably gets into an area where the court's going to step in at some point in time and say yay or nay. And my guess is they're probably going to say nay based on what we already know about where I'm allowed to go on your property and where I'm not allowed to go on your property without a search warrant. So as far as this becoming an everyday tool for law enforcement, I'm not sure that we're at that point just yet without having the court step in and take it one step further. I know that there are some legislative bodies who want to come in now and regulate the use of drones as well. As was already referred to, this may be a further reaching effort where it's not just law enforcement we're talking about. It's anyday citizens can go out to Radio Shack or Sharper Image or Brookstone and buy one of these and put a little camera on it and fly it around and do whatever they want to with it. So
teenagers can spy on their neighbors when they're sunbathing on the deck, right?
So,
I mean, they can.
Implications for law enforcement, yes, practical ones. But I think there's also this gray area that we need to be a little careful of.
Paul, what other business or uses could be found for drones?
Oh gosh. When you think about it, it's virtually unlimited. Anything right now that a drone does can be done by a piloted airplane. And so when you say drones are a threat or a danger, I can't see how they'd be any more so than a piloted vehicle is. The thing that a drone has that piloted vehicles don't have is the ability to stay aloft for a long time. And when we're looking for applications for drones, what we ought to really be looking for are things that take advantage of its manlessness. You know, for example, you have a crew in an airplane and they get tired and they've got to be exchanged. Or whatever, nature calls, something bad happens and you got to get the airplane down. The drone, you don't have that issue because you got a panel that's controlling it. Somebody, an officer is looking at the camera that's on the drone. When his shift's over, drone stays up there and he switches with somebody else. So really, I think the whole idea that this thing's going to be used for intelligence and surveillance is way overblown. For one thing, I don't think it's going to happen yet. You know, the FAA has not approved drones for this kind of use. Now, they have given some exceptions for Border Patrol, and Border Patrols are using them, but the exception means the FAA stops all the other air traffic from coming into the zone where the drone's flying. If you try to get that with a regular police department now, you're going to have all kinds of trouble. The FAA has total authority over the airspace from the ground to outer space. And yeah, the things that we talked about, the little RC-controlled airplanes, they've kind of given them a wink and a nod. I used to do those when I was a kid. And they don't really mess with them as long as, you know, you're kind of line of sight and you're controlling the airplane and it's a small thing. But boy, once it, and right now, the FAA is looking very, very hard at how do you certify this thing to operate in commercial airspace? And they haven't decided that yet. There's all kinds of teams. Collins has one, has members on a team that the FAA is running right now. How are you going to do this? And the real issue is that right now, the major thing for collision prevention, well, there's lots of other little mechanical devices, but the major thing that the military and the FAA depends on is sense and avoid, see and avoid. Pilot, see, avoid. Well, how do you do that with a drone? It's very difficult. Now, there may be some ways they can do it, but it means that much of the avionics on it is going to have to be certified. It's going to get very expensive. So before we even have to worry about these things flying from police departments, we got to somehow worry about this and how expensive they're going to be. And it may turn out that police departments will find out, doesn't make any sense. I'll just go with a manned airplane.
The one thing I found in my research was when people think about satellites that can, from the sky that are miles up, being able to read your license plate, we only knew that there were half a dozen countries that could do that. Okay, then you get to the economics of a country can put a satellite up there, but not everybody. Then you get to planes. Well, more people can put planes up there. And then you get now down to drones, where the distribution and the capacity to buy a drone could be a few $100s, and the distribution is so much wider.
Right.
So it becomes more of a concern. Now, you mentioned the FAA. Now, aren't they about a year and a half out from a lot of decisions on these drones?
Your guess is as good as mine. They've been looking at this for years because people are saying, hey, you know, Federal Express airplanes, why do I need 2 pilots to fly those airplanes? I'm going to have all the technology to be able to fly them with a drone effectively. The Global Hawk that the military uses right now, you can program it to taxi out of its hangar, take off, fly a 36-hour mission, come back, land, taxi back into the hangar without any human intervention. So the technology's there. The question is going to be, do we trust it for things that are in civilian airspace? Right now, the answer is no.
But the 2 things that the FAA controls are the flight paths, the airways, and then the radio and the frequencies. Is that not correct?
Sure, sure.
And so that's the controlling things that will be with them in the future?
Yeah, the FAA is not going to give up any authority, that's for sure. And the FAA is going to be sure that when it certifies the drones, that it's safe. I mean, they have no incentive that I can imagine right now, maybe there will be some, to take any risks in this. So how does the drone detect other airplanes that are up there, maybe manned airplanes, maybe your wife and kids are flying in an airplane with you and here comes this drone out of nowhere? How do you stop that thing from colliding with those airplanes? It doesn't have the see and avoid, the sense and detect, that sort of thing in it right now. So the FAA is going to be very, very concerned with that. I think that's a bigger issue with drones right now than worrying about surveillance. I mean, gosh, the drone doesn't do anything that a manned airplane can't do. So saying that a drone is going to somehow infringe on our privacy or whatever, it doesn't make any sense. We can infringe on our privacy with a drone, with a manned airplane, with a satellite, you know, you name it, with a camera, whatever. A drone's just a tool.
I entirely agree with you, I mean, I think but you're talking about some technical issues here. I mean, there are some really ethical issues involved with surveillance. Say that drones do turn out to be technically feasible for universal surveillance. I mean, then what? I mean, you know, either you can afford them or not. I mean, drones, one of the things we know about how drones are used in Pakistan and Afghanistan is that they hover over communities. And children are out in the grounds playing, and they see the drones hovering over the communities, you know, knowing that they're waiting to blow up somebody's house. right? But on the grounds that there are, judged no doubt accurately, in most cases, people involved with the Taliban or Al Qaeda who live there. And you know, the notion that we might have drones hovering over certain neighborhoods because it's technologically feasible to do this is, I don't think, something we should shrug off.
Jeff,
I don't think we should shrug this off.
I don't disagree with your point there, but what I do disagree with is the fact that a drone's hovering up there is nothing different than a manned airplane hovering up there. The only difference is that the controller is somewhere at a distance.
And we were trying to keep the show on non-military use of drones, Jeffrey. So
I understand, but the issue here is how might they be used for surveillance, and what I get from the White House to the courthouse on our leaders is saying nothing to worry about, nothing to worry about. You know, you don't have anything to worry about. Trust us. Right?
Where do you get that? Where'd that come? I'm sorry.
Well, you're just saying there's nothing to worry about in terms of the use of drones for surveillance.
I'm just saying there's nothing to worry about that's in addition to what you worry about for manned airplanes or satellites or whatever.
Or cameras.
It's just a tool.
Or speed camera.
Yeah.
It is just a tool. And the question is, can we trust the people who have this tool at their available to pay attention to the warnings of George Orwell in 1984, that in the future we're heading toward a universal surveillance state that has all of these tools to watch everyone. And that's what President Obama was alluding to when he said Big Brother. He was alluding to the novel 1984, which I've assigned to thousands of undergraduates at the University of Iowa over the last 35 years. And 30 years ago, people in America thought that we fought the Second World War and the Cold War against communism to put a stop to this kind of universal surveillance state. That's what people. Now people are saying, "Oh, I'm not worried about surveillance because I don't to terrorists, or I give away all my information to Amazon.com anyway. Might as well have universal surveillance." And I think there's a very worrisome ethical issue here, since this is a program about ethics. That is, how far do we really want to go in providing more and more tools for surveillance? How far do we want to go? And that really is the issue of the drones. I mean, the drones are, it's not the technical issues. It may be that drones are too inefficient to use.
No.
I don't know.
But Jeff, isn't it really a question of human nature? I mean, these tools are going to be available to us. We can either use them or abuse them. Yes, and if I just read something in the latest issue of Foreign Affairs, they were talking about big data. And so one of the things in big data is they collect humongous amounts of data, more than we can even imagine a few years ago, and they correlate it, and they draw some conclusions from it.
Sure.
And one of the things they drew was Google went out and with their billion searches a day and said, hey, we'd like to find out what search words correlate with flu epidemics in an area.
Sure.
And they found out that there was about 45 words that if they appeared very often in a certain area, was kind of a precursor that there was going to be a flu outbreak there. And it worked. So it's, it's not correlation equals causation. It's, we don't care about causation anymore. We've got enough correlation, the sample size n equals all.
Yes.
There it is. Now, how do you get that? You collect humongous amounts of data. And your issue of, hey, but some of that's going to be privacy issues. Well, it certainly is, but
some of it is going to be liberty issues.
Let's go ahead, Brian.
Our drone discussion is kind of flying all over.
Yes.
I think there's two issues I think that we need to address, and number one is, what are we talking about here? And I think for law enforcement applications, you're probably talking about the more small drones that we could use. Again, maybe the Brookstone Radio Shack type thing that maybe just be a couple foot in diameter to enable us to put a camera on it and be able to surveil below us, as opposed to the larger military-style drones that are, maybe for several feet to several yards in length and size. For a non-military law enforcement perspective, we're probably talking the smaller unit. The other issue that we need to talk about, and you guys have hashed it over pretty well, is just because you have the technology to do something doesn't mean that we as law enforcement are necessarily going to do that. I have the ability to walk up to your door right now and kick it in. I'm not going to do that. I have the ability to take a drone and fly it into your backyard and surveil all day long. I'm not going to do that either. I think that's what you have to do, is narrow down your focus as to how are you going to use these things. I think them coming to you is inevitable. They're going to be here at some point in time. And as I stated earlier, I think you need to look to the courts, look to their previous rulings, look to what you think may be their forthcoming rulings, and say, well, what are my limitations going to be able to use this thing? And like I say, if you're looking for a lost or missing child or an adult or anything like that, I don't think there's any question you should be able to use them. If I have someone that flees the scene of a crime and goes off into hiding, I think we should be able to use them as well. I don't think the court would even argue with that. But if we're going to spy, for lack of a better word, on your property, I think the court's probably going to require we get some sort of a search warrant or some other authority from the court to be able to allow us to do that. And that's not unusual for law enforcement. When we want to do a lot of things for investigative tools, we have to get the court's permission. So I don't think this is going to be a huge stumbling block for us, and I think that most law enforcement agencies and officers and administrators already realize that there has to be parameters and has to be certain limits to what you can do. This is no different than kicking in a door.
But what I hear you saying, Brian, is that I think there's an application and one that would be acceptable to a lot of people on specific use, specific mission, like, for example, search for a missing child, Amber Alert, if you will.
Yes.
Or perhaps a car accident with missing people that could have hit their head and wandered into something.
Sure.
Or even take a on-the-scene fire battalion chief.
Absolutely.
Who is trying to figure out this big warehouse fire from all sides.
A hazmat scene, something that's not safe to put humans in. You could fly the drone in over a hazmat scene. You have a tanker laying on its side leaking some substance, whatever. You could look at placards. You could look at the scene. You could bring that image right back to the command post, right back to the office, even before they leave.
Or even forest fires with changing winds.
Exactly.
For the effectiveness of fighting and getting that.
Exactly.
Now, one thing I was interested in researching for this program was National Geographic has identified 5 big uses for drones that are coming in. One is hurricane hunting, another is 3D mapping, wildlife protection, such as Africa, agriculture for pests and diseases, and search and rescue. And I think in all these areas, even where you think it might be Big Brother, these are technologies that could save lives. Save property damage.
Exactly.
And going forward, your sense is that there'll be more and more specific missions and types of things identified.
I think that's correct. You start overusing these things and you start using them incorrectly. That's the worst thing that you could possibly do to the technology. You need to understand that all technology has limitations, and you do understand what the courts have said in the past. You can assume what they're going to say in the future, and as long as you stay within those boundaries that have already been pre-established, you should be able to operate fairly well.
And Jeffrey, if I were to ask you the question about whether it's good that the government does this or good that the individuals, is there any difference?
I entirely agree with everything the sheriff has said about specific uses of these. I mean, the worries that we have are the development of, and this is happening all around us, and support for a kind of fishing expedition approach to crime prevention, in which you have sort of universal cameras being operated, and when you have universal fishing expeditions that the NSA does with phone records and with your Google records, which clearly violate the principle of the Fourth Amendment, which says, if you're going to kick down the door and go into somebody's house and look at their records, you've got to have a judge say you've got a good reason to do it. And the government has crossed that line in their surveillance. They have crossed that line, and they've crossed it, I think, at the local and at the national level. And I've given you one example of this in the police use of surveillance cameras. So the worry here is really, I entirely agree that they're perfectly good uses for drones. They might be able to detect variations in soil moisture that could be broadcast to farmers, that help them vary their fertilizer. I think there are a lot of perfectly good domestic uses for drones. But I don't think our worries about the potential use of this as a universal surveillance are silly. And I don't think it's appropriate to shrug them off. I think we need to pay attention to them. I think the sheriff has given us some really good examples of how you use these wisely and constitutionally and not in other ways. My hope is that all of our elected officials, including the Iowa City Council, will reason like he's reasoning in terms of how we're going to use this and other tools of potential tools of surveillance.
I'm going I want to bring something a little closer to the edge, because Brian, I agree with everything you said. The uses that you have there they're way over on one side. Let's move a little closer to the middle, though. What about surveillance of an area of high crime? You know, when I think the Brits have got the CCTV cameras, and we may have that in some of our cities. They're on 24 hours a day, and everybody says that's okay. But for a drone, when a police organization has identified that, hey, this is a high crime area, and should I be surveilling this? Now, I could put a few squad cars out there, but with one drone, I may be able to look at the whole area and get a sense for what's going on. Is that okay?
Well, I don't know, and but I think that people are not sufficiently worried about the fact that it might not be okay. I think people should buy a copy of 1984 by George Orwell and go home and read it, and think, how far do we want to go in terms of universal surveillance? That's what I think people should do. I think people should think about this. What I hear, you know, I just drove across the country back from the East Coast, and of course the airwaves are full of these discussions of surveillance and so forth. And I heard person after person come on and say, "I don't care. All of my information is public anyway. I don't care if the government looks at it." You know, they're saying this, or they would say, "It's okay if they spy on all my phone conversations because I never talk to terrorists." They say, and I thought, really? People who are willing to give up their, you know, liberty for security and trust the government don't deserve either. That's Benjamin Franklin's comment on this.
Peter,
So
if I could,
Yeah.
if I
Go
could
ahead,
just
Brian.
respond to Paul's comment, I agree with you completely. And what I like in that too is if you have the ability to be there to begin with, it's a public area. I can be there as a law enforcement officer. I can be there. My presence is allowed. Then I don't see any difference being there on the ground level or being there on an elevated level for exactly that same reason. I don't see an issue.
Well, there
with
is
that.
one.
You go back to Officer Bailey situation. He came to your house. He knocked on the door. He said, "Hey, can I do this?" You said no. No problem. I'll go to the next house. He could have just as easily walked over to a fixed position, a lamp post in the park, and mounted that there into a public area. It was completely allowable. Sure. Anybody's allowed to be in the public, and the cameras and the drones would be the same situation.
Well,
I think the court has recognized that as well.
Let me ask you this, though. I mean, when you've got a drone in the air instead of someone walking down the street or a street camera, what about if you see somebody sitting out on their deck in their backyard breaking the law by smoking a joint, which is clearly against the law, right? I mean, when you have what they used to call a bear in the air, right?
In a public area.
But this is a private area. And you know, these drones can see into backyards.
Sure.
They can see into private areas. I mean, the Supreme Court has ruled that these heat censoring devices that find you know, marijuana growers are illegal. But what about this? What about somebody in their backyard?
We're down to just a minute left in the program, Jeffy. Can I get one final comment, Paul? Anything?
Yeah, I think we need to think
Real
of
quick.
drones as a tool.
Tool.
And
Don't misuse it.
don't misuse it. Exactly.
Jeffrey, you
Well,
want to...
do you think it's a misuse to look into someone's backyard for a criminal offense? So
There's both people on both
because
sides.
that seems to me to be right at the boundary where we ought to be thinking
Brian?
about these things.
They're coming. I think as long as rules
Let's
are in
talk
place.
about it, get
Yep,
these issues
absolutely.
out and discuss.
Absolutely.
I'd like to thank all three of you for joining me this morning. It's an issue with many sides to it. I didn't know you had a piece of the book 1984 on royalties, Jeffrey. So, anyway, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Go out and make our community a better place. On behalf of the Religious Council of Cedar Rapids, Linn County, thank you very much.